What's up, guys? Hope everyone is doing well. In this video, I'm going to be going over some updates for Bitcoin. In recent posts, I briefly mentioned that there were a number of events, a cascade, to happen across these varying time frames that I typically go over. So from the 4-hour, we'll end at the weekly. But anyways, first off here on the 4-hour chart, going back to the last video, I pointed out for the first time in over a month, the most interesting thing had been happening. Bitcoin is testing the descending resistance and the 200 EMA here. That has, with the descending resistance, been attacked since the prior all-time high. 200 EMA has been notable resistance and rejection points since the beginning of this downtrend here, going back to the latter portion of 2025. And so we're seeing these key structures. The 200 EMA broken, this descending resistance is broken. Now we're testing what was ascending support. It's been recently turned into ascending resistance. We've seen a couple 4-hour candle closes above this. So currently Bitcoin is battling this here on the 4-hour. The 800 EMA sits at around 98.8 thousand, so approximately 100,000. We'll see how really the zone where Bitcoin is right now, so the horizontal, what was resistance here has been these rejection points throughout this entire relief so far. It's really the beginning of the first most important zone, which ends at around $100,000. So seeing Bitcoin cement support around this, what was resistance, or rather what was a support, it's now become resistance, flips this back into support, or just generally begins to show strength above this trend line. Then a move up to potentially somewhere around the 800 EMA, approximately $100,000 or so could be in store. There's really just not much resistance above or anywhere in between around 94 to around $100,000. So that entire zone right there is quite, it's a good room for the price to play around in, to see perhaps this quick move somewhere up to around this 382 of the trend base Fibonacci extension, what sits around 101,000. The 800 and 200 EMA sit approximately around 97,000. So again, as I said, we're seeing Bitcoin test the 272, really this 236 to 272 was the resistance zone of the relief so far. We're seeing this being broken, and like I said, there are plenty of reasons to think that we could see potentially a quick move of Bitcoin up to around $100,000 or so, because there's really nothing in this above zone up until around $100,000 that poses any severe obstacle of resistance. We can see the 382 was the rough support going back to the first week of May 2025, where we saw Bitcoin here distributing. It was topping out. Now we've been obviously in this downtrend that has invoked extreme amounts of fear, and now we are seeing the earliest moments, the earliest signs at least, that Bitcoin is reversing towards the upside, but obviously there's still plenty of more criteria to meet. And so if we go back to the 4 hours, I mentioned the 200 EMA broken. The 12-hour chart here, when it broke the 50 EMA, which is one of the most crucial developments here on the 12-hour, as we're leading into breaking the prior resistance zone, happened January 3rd. This is when on the 4-hour chart the 200 EMA was broken. So we're seeing the interrelation here of these time frames as we go from lower to higher. We're seeing these cascades that I was mentioning, where something happens on a lower time frame and then it trickles into its reflection in a higher time frame, and then so on and so forth throughout the varying time frames. And if we move here to the daily, we'll see that this is coinciding with the daily breaking the 50 EMA with a close above it with a prior weekly candle about an hour ago, or rather the daily candle. Testing and currently finding resistance at the upper bound of the 50 EMA band, so that's approximately $94.5 thousand, which is generally, again, the horizontal zone here. What was resistance during the relief so far needs to be broken. So seeing furthermore here for the tentative aspects here that still need to be met, going above basically 95,000, seeing a daily candle close above 95,000 and continuing to go higher, with the 200 EMA sitting here at approximately $100,000. So again, we're seeing this zone shape up here more so now on the daily, on a more critical, relatively higher time frame. And so we see the zone here again created around $100,000, this area of free play where we could see, once Bitcoin cements support right here, finds its local low where it currently is, we could see a quick candle or two move up to around $100,000, which is what I've mentioned in the last few posts, which also lines up with the daily resistance zone, which was the prior double top peak back here during the end of 2024 going into the beginning of 2025. It was support here. I pointed this out as 382 on the 12-hour chart. And so this all lines up with the 200 EMA lying at its bottom bound. So again, we could see potentially, if it does overextend a bit, if it doesn't fund immediate and quick resistance at around closer to 100,000, we could see some movement up to, whether it's wicks, candle closes, somewhere around like 105, 106, maybe $107,000. See Bitcoin do something like this, sit here within this general area, continue up to prior all-time highs, maybe sit here for a bit, and then enter price discovery. There's plenty of different routes that could take, but the next most crucial thing is to see this daily cement strength and volatility volume above the 50 EMA band. If you look here at the RSI, we'll see that every time the price, or rather the RSI here, gets above the 618, this lines up with notable moves. It lines up with this move back here. Less volatile moves, for example, here, around here, here, and here. But typically, when we see this happen, it does coincide with a strong move in Bitcoin, whether it's a shorter-lived burst or a longer-lived impulse towards the upside. And so we've seen the RSI building up towards this 618. The price is sitting in a very primed spot for the potential here to become actuality, and seeing this break above the 618. If you look here at the stock RSI, it has peaked, but it is in this upper zone, which if it can maintain this upper zone, coincides with movement towards the upside, bullish volatility and momentum towards the upside. The MACD has really been bullish since like mid-December, or rather it was in like a gray period ambiguously. It was transitioning into bullish more so late December actually. It's recently broken above the 50 or the 0 point, so it's going to be potentially, depending upon how things go over the next week, going into the rest of this month, beginning of 2026, this momentum is going to either be, maybe we'll see something just to move up to here, further rejection, sideways movement for longer, a movement up to this zone, rejection into lower lows. But this could, best case scenario, line up with a break of this zone here, continuing to go higher, and actually end the price discovery once more. We're seeing the RVI really being entrenched in lower bound and bearish volatility since going back to November, during the transition period into the brunt of this move here. Like I said, going into like late November. And now we're seeing the RSI, or rather the RVI here, the relative volatility index, flip in towards the upper bound. Similar to the stock RSI, if it can maintain this upper bound, it will reflect in the price with movement towards the upside. The bear sentiment on ASO has been in dominance since beginning of January. So far, January looks and is shaping up to be quite good, if only it does follow through with a few more critical developments towards the upside. Most notably, now here on the daily, the first really significant time frame we're getting above this 50 EMA band and moving up to the 200 EMA, setting support and strength here, continuing higher than 200 EMA ultimately, which means ideally higher than the upper bound here of the yellow zone, somewhere around $107,000, moving into this next zone right here somewhere, which you can also see is where the 50 EMA band kind of straddled sideways for a bit, somewhere around $113,000, give or take a few $1,000. So somewhere around like 111,000, 115,000 or so. It's probably a zone that could potentially come into play, assuming Bitcoin actually first breaks this zone here. So there's really two main points that I can make here. So breaking above this zone and then moving into this kind of median between this sideways price action here as the price distributed in this top, and then finally breaking that. We'll put the median somewhere around 114.5 or so. Now if we look here at this 2-day chart, so the last chart before we go into the weekly, we'll see that the 50 EMA band here is encompassing a price zone of 93.5, so approximately 94,000, upwards towards around 99.3, so approximately $100,000. So precisely the zone that I have been mentioning in recent posts. So now, as I began with on the 4-hour, we're seeing these cascades, we're seeing this trickling effect. Now we're here at the 2-day, and we can see the before we get to the weekly, the second highest time frame setup of the importance of this zone that I'm mentioning, around 94 current resistance. So the relief upwards towards around 100,000, which was a very crucial median zone with respect to the double top back here, the distribution in this top here where it was finding support until it rejected, going into the latter half of this most recent entire downtrend here. And so we're seeing the RSI lift off here. The compression of the Bollinger Bands was quite intense leading into this. Breaking above this resistance here is going to be the next big step. So seeing the RSI here get above anywhere around 55. MACD has been bullish since the end of, so the beginning of December. It's also recently peaking its head above the 0 point. So we could see a flip. We could be seeing, in best case scenario here, something similar to here where we see the consolidation at the end of a downtrend in an accumulation zone. Locally speaking, it could be something similar here. For example, this one was ascending, this one here has been ascending, and so we could just be seeing the RSI got the most oversold that it's got here on the 2-day since going all the way back to the end of the prior bear market, which was approximately $16,000, but yet the price recently hitting 80,000 got more oversold than that. So there's a number of hidden bullish divergences that you could point out here, and that's happened plenty of times throughout this current bull run structure. That is, despite the bearish divergence preceding these hidden bullish divergences, continuing to propel the price forward and higher into price discovery. And as of right now, with still a number of crucial bull market structures intact, most notably being this horizontal zone here at approximately 77.5 thousand according to this 2-day chart. This right here is really outside of this local support here, ascending and horizontally. This really is kind of the last bull market structure intact, as I've been saying for months. If this eventually over the next rest of this month, however long it may be, taking it to be that this scenario plays out where we do see the price lose this zone here, then that, as I've said plenty of times, I think is going to be really the end-all be-all for the current bull run that Bitcoin has been in since the end of 2022. But I still think that there is, for example, let's say Bitcoin gets rejected here around the 50 EMA and its band, the 200 EMA, this crucial zone of around 94 to around 100,000 that I pointed out. Let's say it gets rejected here into lower lows and it breaks this. I still think there's potential for the price to break this, maybe sit here, somewhere within this, zone of price. So anything above 70,000, still find support here and continue to move higher, just because that potential does exist, although I don't think it's all that likely. I would put a lower degree of likelihood to that happening, something like 70-30 for the case that it actually maintains support below this horizontal support that is the most prior macro structure. If you look at the bull market, as I pointed out, there's these, here, 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 and here. Subsequently, as we've seen the progression of this bull market, all these structures have never been lost. These horizontal lows have always been maintained, going into further and further price action, as you see here. And so that needs to maintain a structure for the current bull run, so as to not see the internal characteristics of what has defined this bull run start to break down and then transition into what would then characterize an upcoming bear market. So we're seeing plenty of things unfold here that are continuing to support at least, you know, a reasonable entertainment of the bull scenario. If you look here at the RVI, it's been in an uptrend since October 18th. So the price of Bitcoin here has been going down. RVI has been building up. So you can interpret that as kind of the point that hit some bullish divergence. You're seeing it's peaking its head above the median here. So if it could only, for example, as we see here, the RVI was deviated towards the upside here. It was chopping in the upper bound, and this coincides with price action and price movement towards the upside. So I need to see the RVI get out of this lower bound, flip into the upper bound. As we see the MACD have a nice momentum break, as we see the RSI continue to move higher above this resistance, move into the 61.8 zone, and continue to move higher towards the oversold region, as we see all this pressure has been built up in this local low zone where it's you know, synonymous with accumulation, similar to what happened here, here during the end of this downtrend. And so once we see that, we see this 50 EMA band broken here at the top of it, sitting $100,000, which that's, you know, obviously not important. Just clearly I've already demonstrated, structurally speaking, $100,000 is a crucial value, technically speaking, but also psychologically speaking. Once we start to see, because Bitcoin's been in states of extreme fear and fear for, you know, since October, maybe a little bit longer, and a very crucial aspect of that would be being below $100,000, and getting back above $100,000 will start to psychologically, you know, invoke people to begin to feel better about the market. They'll begin to see more hope and more light in the potential future of Bitcoin. You know, altcoins going higher, because altcoins have been insanely lackluster this time around. And so once we start to see Bitcoin do that, then really the entire space begins to become renewed with more, you know, actual hope for movement towards the upside, as opposed to everything that's been seen since really October of last year. There's also to look out for, lastly here on the 2-day, this ascending resistance, which really is anywhere from around 134,000 upwards towards around 140,000. So we could see Bitcoin just move up to this. Maybe that's the end of the bull market. I think personally it's going to go higher for various different reasons I've gone over in the past number of videos. But here lastly for the weekly, to conclude the point that I wanted to make with this, like I said, so we began at the 4-hour, went to 12-hour, went to the daily, went to the bi-daily. We're seeing these this cascade, you know, from the 200 EMA on the 4-hour, then we go to the 50 EMA on both the 12-hour and the daily, and then we see the importance of those EMAs, you know, that I mentioned, whether it's the 800 EMA on the bi-daily, getting into that zone of 94 to 100,000, breaking 100,000, continuing towards these higher potential resistance zones that I pointed out in the past time frames. And now here on the weekly, we see it all culminating with what appears to be, price-wise here, if we looked at it, looks as if the price is beginning to round out, perhaps very much so going to be similar to what happened here. We can actually see that these, so far, these look very similar. We saw a first low here, some brief relief into a lower low here. We see something very similar here, where we see a low, brief relief, it's very barely even noticeable, into a lower low here. Now we're seeing the price start to round out towards the upside. It could be eventually showing itself to unfold quite similar to this move. And as a brief note to make before I get into the main aspect of this time frame, one of the, I believe I mentioned it in a past video, but basically the structure of the bull market that I see here is this first impulse, second impulse, or rather, this is the second impulse, and then this third impulse here is actually been significantly extended and elongated, which, I mean, that's been the general trend. You can see this first impulse here compared to the second impulse. The second one's longer than the first, so the trend should be keeping up that the third here is going to be longer than the second, but it's been extended by quite a larger degree than I was figuring in my own perception of the market going forward. And obviously the temporal trend has been, each of these impulses here ends, you know, March, April, so spring here 2023, this in here spring 2024. So the next state would have been spring of 2025, would have been the end of the third impulse. So obviously that would have been somewhere, you know, I think somewhere approximately $200,000. So that would have been something along these lines. But obviously it didn't happen. And right as we saw Bitcoin here reach the midpoint of this impulse, this third impulse here, it corrected towards the downside, and it's been in this ascending, what I'll just call, an ascending accumulation or consolidation range that's basically acting as the connector point of the two legs of this overall third impulse here, where this is obviously the consolidative connector. This here is the first leg of the overall impulse, and we're heading into the second leg of the overall impulse, which is very similar to these prior ones where you can see it's basically just an ABCD pattern where we see a movement up here to A, or 1, then we go down 2, then 3, and this time around, instead of it being 1, 2, then 3, it's been 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we move up to a fifth stage, and then overall this here is a 1, 2, 3, and then, or rather, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then going up to 5 would have ended this in this overall 5 stages, and then with these 3 major impulsive legs. So that aside, giving kind of the broader structure of what's happening here, if we look at the ASO in conjunction with this, we see the first leg happen. Bear market bottom is set. Bear run is over. We see the price of the first impulse here move into the 50 EMA. This is the first major battleground. This cemented, once we saw the price move above the 50 EMA here, cemented the bull run. Beginning, it was really the final moments in the journey that the price had to make in order to, what was here bear market resistance, flip this bear market resistance here into support, moving into the bull market. And as I pointed out in the last video, you can see here on the ASO, if you look at these blue trends here, beginning August 12th, 2024, so the local low here, moving into this local low, and then currently the, what I'm propositioning as the local low that's moving into another leg towards and into price discovery. You can see here that each of these zones have lined up with these lows along these trends. We're seeing the bear sentiment hit this trend line, which is already hit twice beforehand, and it's coiling down. We're seeing the bullish sentiment starting to coil up, and we could see something very similar as each of these occurrence, where we see the bullish sentiment coil up. Eventually we see the bullish flip here, where the bullish sentiment here takes dominance towards the upside, and then the bearish sentiment here takes a lack of dominance, a submissive nature towards the downside, where we would see the price begin to move up here back towards prior all-time highs for eventually into price discovery. And if you look here at the EMAs on this chart, you can see that the most crucial one to point out here is the 50 EMA. The 13 EMA does sit at around 95, so you can say that's kind of really, once we see a weekly candle close above the 13 EMA, which I'm inclined to believe that by the time that's happening, it's basically just going to be at or closing above the 50 EMA, which is why I said 50 EMA is really the only important thing to look at here, which is currently sitting at 97.4 thousand. The upper bound sits at around 102.6 thousand, lower bound of the band around 93,000. So really this also is kind of just a tad bit bigger zone that I've been pointing out, as I said, somewhere around 94 to 100,000. We see here, like I said, 93 up to around 103,000. So again, we're seeing this zone attested to from the 4-hour to 12-hour to the daily to the bi-daily. Now we're on the weekly. So again, we need to see Bitcoin move back above 100,000, start to hit somewhere around 105, 106,000, and then continue to move up above that. Once it can finally reach prior all-time highs here, and then enter into the ascending resistance zone that goes all the way back to the double top of the 2021 bull market all-time high distribution zone, we can see that this is obviously going to pose significant threats to Bitcoin continuing to move above this. So this creates a zone anywhere from around 126,000 per all-time highs upwards towards around 140,000. So again, like I said, even going back to if we look here at this shorter time frame resistance on the 2-day, this also points to a zone of around $130,000 to $140,000. So in this context, there could be, obviously around 2 different scenarios. Either we're going to see Bitcoin, well, I'll say 3. We're going to see Bitcoin have a very minor relief up to the 50 EMA band, around $100,000 rejected here into lower lows, bull run's over. Or maybe we come down below, somewhere down to around, 75, low 70,000s, somehow manage to find support here, even though this horizontal zone was lost. That's also a scenario. Or we could see Bitcoin move up to prior all-time highs, maybe set a horizontal double top here, bear market's begun, maybe move it here into this zone, $130,000, $140,000. This ends the bull run, or the one that I'm leaning to. We see Bitcoin move up to this zone. We see it broken, and we see at least somewhere around $170,000 hit, somewhere around like here, upwards towards around $230,000, $250,000 at highest. I don't think it's going to go too significantly higher than that. And I think really more of a proximal zone around 200, around like 215,000 is more likely for an uppermost extension. But again, that is really deduced from various different things, but mainly this chart here, which I went over in the last video. I went over this Fibonacci extension. Each of these here, we can see for each of these bear runs here, I've been going over this for probably 2 years, maybe a little bit longer at this point, but every time, when you take these forms of extensions, 272 as a proximal zone has always been hit. We take the bear market extension here, the 272 has not been hit yet, rather than more specifically, it's at 2.272. Like I said, that has not been hit yet, which sits approximately $210,000, with the entire zone somewhere around 175, upwards towards around like $250,000, $260,000. And so, going back to this weekly, again, that is one of the biggest reasons why I do think, and really, I mean, going back to the end of the past bull run, or rather the bear run, this has been the rough range around 170, well, just kind of $150,000 to $250,000 is the broadermost range that I've been pointing to since the end of the last bear run, and that has yet to have been hit yet, with obviously that sweet spot somewhere around like $215,000, $230,000, $230,000 or so. And so, last thing I want to point out here is that, let's say absolute worst case scenario, we lose the horizontal support here. The 200 EMA does sit at around currently 67.5 thousand. This, again, like I said, absolute worst case scenario, because as I pointed out here using this this chart here in the last video, we could also look here at this chart. We can see here with the vector candles, each of these pink candles that you'll see here at this bottom, that was back in 2011. This bottom here, 2014 and 15. This bottom here, 2018, 19. The most recent bottom here, 2022. And then also you can see it here briefly at the March 2020 crash. And so what's weird is that we're also seeing these vector candles printed here recently, as we've been straddling a very light downtrend since the around mid-November of 2025. And so what's interesting is that typically these vector candles, as I pointed out, here, 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 and here, they're always towards the end. They're in the latter half portion of bear runs. But yet we're seeing these highly oversold RSI vector candles printed in, if this is the beginning of the bear run, it's never happened like this, because you can see, for example, here or even here, they're not printed. Here, they're not printed. Here, they're not printed. All the way, they're not always printed towards the end of the bear runs. Yet we're seeing them printed at literally within, the all-time high, distribution zone, if this is indeed the actual beginning of the bear run. And so the most comparable instance would be to the March crash here, which further confirms what can be deduced from the RSI trends here. As I pointed out in the last video, you see these deviations here in blue. The only time this has happened in the past was the March crash. So that's why I think this is something very similar to that, to where it's basically a very significant, a very intense fake out that's actually going to then eventually culminate into quite volatile movement towards the upside. But that was really all that I wanted to go over and update in this video, mainly pointing out, really kind of setting the stage as we're entering here into 2026, what is very crucial for the price of Bitcoin, technically speaking. And also, just as a final note to end the video, I went over it very briefly. for a few minutes in the last video, but the macroeconomic landscape, the fundamental landscape, if you want to refer back to that video, I spoke about it a little bit more specifically, but I mean, it's just continuing to get better and better and better. It's never been better, and I think over the next, few years, definitely the next year, I think the next 10 years for Bitcoin, blockchain adoption in general is going to just continue to exponentiate and propel at a rate which we haven't seen yet, and really take things within this space to a level that hasn't been seen before. And I think that that's obviously going to be clearly enough, creating a very good environment for Bitcoin to see at least one final move leading into spring, early summer of 2026. But all that being said and everything gone over, as always, none of this is meant to be financial advice, and I hope you all enjoyed and that you have a wonderful day.
Start to